done is brilliantly shown how Chinese characters are composed of elements that are similar to Western alphabet. If I move to this slide, I think you'll get the picture more clearly. He's created an alphabet in which he's used components that are very familiar to people who write Chinese calligraphy, because many of these forms are actually derived from Chinese characters themselves. So if I go back now, I think you can begin by seeing the first character on the far upper left corner is the word rain. Can you make that out? Yeah. So the rest of it I think you can read on your own. Rain, rain, go away. Come again another day. Little Johnny wants to play. So the point of that is that Chinese characters are actually learned by practicing over and over, tracing in trace books like the one that you see this student using, looking at the models and copying them until you master the craft. And ultimately, it is an art of mastering the supple tip brush and the creation of lines, and the assemblage of those lines into individual characters, which are words. There is no alphabet in Chinese. Chinese language is made up of something like 40,000 characters. And when you put two characters together, for example, the word for news and the word for paper, you get newspaper. So you can create an infinite number of words through the use of these 40,000 characters. Nobody knows all 40,000 characters. A college student might know about 10,000 characters, but in combination, they can create a very large vocabulary indeed. But what is important about the art of writing is, in China, it became the most respected art, even regarded more highly than painting, because like our own autographs, Chinese writing was seen as a way of really expressing your own personality. So we start by learning a way of writing that is based on models. This is a character written by a princess in the early 8th century. It's actually, the character is greatly enlarged on the screen. It's about the size of your fingernail. So there's an amazing amount of dexterity and control in the way in which each of these lines is created. You can see that there's a definite start and an ending where the brush tip is sort of turned back and lifted up. And that rhythmic control of the brush line over and over again, you could say that there's a pictographic basis of this. The character is shu, which means to write, or also means book, so these characters have multiple meanings. And if you look at it carefully, you might be able to visualize a hand with fingers holding a brush that's writing on a tablet. So there's your hand with fingers holding a vertical brush writing on a tablet. So there is, in many cases, a pictographic a predecessor to the more stylized writing of today. But what has become the norm is to make the character beautiful by creating a set of lines that are each one of them dynamic and independently beautiful, but they cohere. There's a kind of equilibrium that's created that this dynamic character holds together. And you write these characters in columns, starting in the right and moving down the column and then from right to left. So like the Hebrew text in the Torah, it's also written from right to left. Chinese is written in that direction, and so that directional sensibility also applies to scrolls that also unroll from right to left, and we'll look at that as well. So here's another kind of writing. As in any language, there is an abbreviated or cursive style of writing, and this is an example by Huang Tingjian, written around the year 1099. Huang Tingjian was in exile when he wrote this, and this is a transcription of a story that took place in the 4th century BC. And it actually involved the same Qin state that later became the Qin dynasty that created the Terracotta Army. And it was about a general and a prime minister who were both extremely powerful in the state of Zhao. And they were in competition with one another. And the general, in fact, was so resentful of the successes of the prime minister in negotiating with the Qin state that it looked like they were going to come to blows. So the prime minister very wisely stepped back, and this is where Huang Tianzhen, who himself had been forced out of office because of this kind of political infighting, ended his scroll with this commentary. So let me read it to you. It starts with this wonderful large character, which is the character for tiger. It's given the tiger a very long tail. So there's a lot of expressive energy here. This is a man who is obviously extraordinarily moved by his own circumstance that he's been exiled from political office. So it reads, Hu Gong Do. Let me get over there. See, sorry. Yeah. Hu Gong Do. Qi shi bu zhu bu zhu sheng. 无所以为此者，先国家之己，而后四丘也. So that last character, 也, is a kind of a final. It doesn't carry a lot of meaning, but it notes the end of the phrase. And he's put an enormous amount of energy in that. And the ink in the brush is meanwhile running out, so the brush is becoming very raspy and dry as he pulls it across the paper. So it's a kind of exclamation mark. There's no punctuation in classical Chinese, but these are hints as to how to read the inscription. So what is he saying? He says, when two tigers come into combat, only one can survive. For that reason, I have put the good of the country first and put private animosities aside. Sound relevant? So this is an extraordinarily powerful text written by Sima Qian. He's the Herodotus of China. He wrote the first history of China back in about 140 BC. And here we are, 1,200 years later. That text still carries meaning to this author, to this calligrapher. So, in another passage, the writer is transcribing how it describes how the state of Zhao, if it gives a jade disc, a B, to Qin in exchange for cities, and Qin does not give the cities, what do? So that was the bargain that was in play diplomatically at the time with the prime minister negotiating this. The Qin state said, we're going to give you 15 cities for a jade disc. Well, there was a lot of trepidation that they weren't going to honor that promise. They'd get the jade disc and then they'd say, sorry, you don't get the cities. So this is the question. So that too, you see the emotionalism in the writer's hand as the ink runs out of the brush, the characters change in size. But look at the character that's enlarged on the side of the screen. That is the character for a jade disc. It's a circular piece of jade with a perforation in the hole in the middle. It's this extraordinarily dynamic abstraction. For those of us who can't read it, it's beautiful in its own right as a work of art. And so I put this scroll adjacent to a contemporary work of art when I showed it last. This is the scroll from around 1100. This is a work by Wang Dongling from around the year 2000. So exactly 1,000 years apart. Wang Dongling certainly knows the art of Huang Tianzhen. So there's extraordinary sense of being able to draw inspiration from the past in the work of contemporary artists. And so I put it there for a reason. I wanted people who couldn't read calligraphy to feel that they had permission to appreciate it the way we appreciate contemporary art. In fact, when I was taking a Chinese reporter through this exhibition, he looked at some Westerners looking at the long hand scroll. And he said, they can't read it. How can they appreciate it? So I said, okay, tell me about this one. Well, he couldn't read that. It's not a word, in fact. It's a pure abstraction. But I said, Western audiences know how to look at abstraction. They understand figure-ground relationships. They understand gestural art. If they can appreciate that calligraphy, they can appreciate, if they can appreciate Wang Dongling's abstraction, they can also look at calligraphy in the same way. I want to encourage you to think of calligraphy in that manner as well. So when you put the traditional calligraphy next to the modern abstraction, you can see a lot of commonalities, a sense of movement. You can trace the hand of the artist as he makes these different gestural strokes. the way in which they have this dynamic presence on the page, all of that lines up. Well, just to take the analogy a little further, one of the things that Chinese collectors have admired for at least 1,000 years are these strangely eroded rocks. Look at the comparison between the rock and the character for a stone disc. There's a lot of similarities, the same kind of dynamism, the same kind of asymmetry that is nonetheless, there's a kind of equilibrium, a balance, precarious. There's a sense of movement to both the rock and the character. So those aesthetic ideals apply across different media as well as just for calligraphy itself. So now I want to move us to painting proper. And with that background, you have a sense now of the importance of line, the expressive possibility of line. This is a little painting. It's barely a foot tall by maybe 14, 16 inches long. It was painted around the year 750, maybe 720 to 750 AD. And it's a drawing of a horse. And all of the inscriptions and the red seals around it are by later collectors who have valued this, treasured it, and left their marks on the work of art as a way of letting people know that they too had this in their hands and were able to appreciate it. We can trace the ownership of this scroll from the 9th century down to the 20th century, just by basis of the marks and inscriptions that are appended to this. It's a picture of a stallion, part of the emperor's stables. The name of the horse is Knight Shining White. It's one of the great treasures at the Met. And what the artist has done is he has drawn on the archetypical way of visualizing a horse in Chinese tradition. This is a rubbing from the Han Dynasty, so about 500 years earlier than the horse painting. And as you can see, it's simply a profile image of a horse. The horse actually couldn't stand up because there's only 2 left legs are standing on the ground. So we know it's not accurate in that sense, but it is filled with the energy that the line gives it. So this is a rubbing of from a tile. Well, that's part of what animates Han Gan's horse. At the same time, there's a new sense of naturalism. This is a man who is said not to have studied painting from looking at old masters, but by going to the stables and studying horses themselves. And this is a photograph by Edward Muybridge. He was extraordinarily influential in documenting how people walked, how horses ran. Artists like Degas used Muybridge's photographs to create a new sense of realism. When you look at the legs of Han Gan's horse, in the early 8th century, he's already captured a lot of the sense of animation and movement that the horse conveys. But what really matters in the description of the horse is not just the physical appearance. He does suggest something of the mass of the horse, the body movements through the shaded lines, the contour lines. But look at the head, look at the way the mane is standing on edge. And I love the detail of the horse's eye with these beautiful mascara eyelashes and the wonderful hairs in his nostrils that are radiating out in a spiral. So there's no doubt that there's a kind of combination of stylization and naturalism at play here. But the whole idea is to give this horse a sense of life energy and of the extraordinary untamed quality of his character, which was obviously supremely valued. Now, 600 years later, an artist by the name of Zhang Fu paid homage to Han Gan and his representation of a horse in this very image. The horse, like the one by Han Gan, well, let's look at them together. They're both white horses with black highlighting. So clearly he's making a reference. He's using the past creatively. This is what artists always do, as you know very well. Art doesn't come from nothing, it comes from tradition. So here's a man who's referencing the past in his painting by recreating that image of a horse, but subtly changing it now. The line, again, is what is emphatically emphasized here. There's very little shading, except in the lower legs of the horse, but everything depends on a few very geometric lines to convey a sense of the horse's energy and dynamism. Time to hydrate. But what Zhang Fu excels in is now the line is this iron wire line. It's very fine. It's like the lines of a calligraphy. So the way in which he defines the face, the physical characteristics of the horse no longer rely on any shading to highlight the physical three-dimensionality of the horse. It's all carried by the line itself. And he uses that same kind of treatment, very abstract frontal treatment, to describe the face of the groom as well. And there's a sense of personality and kindred spirits between the horse and the groom. So from the depiction of figures and horses, one of the major evolutionary steps in Chinese art was the evolution of early creation of landscape. Landscape painting appears in China from very early times, but by the 10th and 11th century we have this same love of monochrome line work to describe the complexities of nature is really carried to a new extreme. This is a scroll that's about 18 inches high, maybe it's 40 inches long, but it captures this extraordinary sense of the natural world in a summer evening. Let me take you through it. Let me also point out that this idea of adding inscriptions onto the surface of the painting, along with seals of ownership, was something that developed so early because there was a sense that they weren't destroying the illusion of reality, because always there was this tension between describing the real world and also recognizing that what was important was the brushwork, was the hand of the artist. And if the hand of the artist is what mattered, then adding inscription wasn't going to interfere with that aspect of appreciation. It's an interesting concept. I don't particularly admire the emperor who put his inscriptions on so many of China's great paintings, but he obviously took great pleasure in ownership. So I'm going to start by moving through this landscape. As I said, with inscriptions too, you move from right to left in a hand scroll. So as you unroll this scroll, you would start at this end and move into the landscape. And so that's what I'm going to do with the details. When you start out on this journey, you see that you see that in the foreground there are these boats that have been moored for the night. They've struck their sails. There's a flight of geese that is heading into the distance. So it's evening. And we see the thick foliage of the trees on the mountain slopes. It's clearly summer. It's a summer evening with mist rising through the valleys. And as we move through the landscape, the artist has created pathways and fellow travelers for us to identify with. So here's an image where we see the little detail of a man on a donkey followed by a servant. And this is in the foreground, so we can identify with him, but look where he is. He's actually right down here. So when we follow the traveler and look up, we suddenly get a new sense of the scale of the mountains. Because the figures are so small, suddenly the mountains become huge, towering figures. And notice that the mountains are surrounded by a bank of mist. You cannot follow the foreground into the background in a continuous line. In Chinese painting, there's an aversion to using the same kind of naturalistic or mathematical perspective that we see in Renaissance and post-Renaissance painting in the West. Instead, they want to keep that sense of distance vague so that the landscape becomes immeasurable. And so as we look up into the mountains, we see that there's also the presence of man. I remember once going to a mountain, famous pilgrimage site in China, and they created a road up the back side. The front side, you have all these stairs carved into the rock. You have pavilions where you can sit down and rest. There are temples to spend the night. The back side was completely barren. There was no sense of human presence. And it felt like the moon. It felt like another world, because in China, mankind is an integral part of the landscape. You cannot separate man from the landscape. So always in a Chinese landscape painting, you can find traces of human activity, such as this wonderful temple complex clinging to the side of the mountain. So as we move on in our journey, we follow the landscape trails, we find other figures alongside. There's some fishermen that we can greet in their boat alongside as we come along this pathway. And as we look up above that path, there's yet another temple complex that can welcome us. And we can see inside the temple there are gentlemen who are conversing, they are looking out on the landscape, so suddenly instead of being a traveler, we are enjoying the view. We have found our residence for the night. It's like getting to Mohonk Mountain House in the Catskills or one of these resorts. So this is what Buddhist temples were used for in China. You went there to eat vegetarian food, to relax, to attune yourself to the natural world. The scroll ends with a pathway that leads into the distance, so you can climb the mountains and continue your journey on your own. But look down at the base of the mountain. We see that there is actually a trail where we have a man, a porter, carrying his load back into the scroll. So what the Chinese artist has cleverly done is, rather than ending abruptly, he turns us around, he brings us back into the landscape. So ultimately, the landscape becomes this extraordinarily enclosed world that at the very center of which is this towering central mountain, which artists at that time described as being like the emperor presiding over his court, presiding over his empire. So the hierarchy, the natural hierarchy, became a template or model for the ruler to emulate. And so in a way, paintings like this, created for the court, were a way of celebrating the orderly universe that had been created by the wise rulership of an emperor. So these paintings were done with a political motivation. They had a message. Now, maybe 50 years later, landscape changed dramatically. It became more personal. And this is a work of art by Guo Xi, a known artist, one of the leading painters of landscape in the late 11th century. Probably done when he was already quite old. Maybe he was in his 80s when he did this scroll. And this was done as a gift, a present for a man who was retiring from office and preparing to leave the capital and return to his home. So there's a kind of somber quality to this. It's a moment of sadness, a parting of friends. So it's an autumnal scene, very different in spirit than the lush foliage of summertime that we saw in the earlier painting. You see this extraordinarily expansive landscape. As the scroll begins, we look out across this watery plain to distant mountains. There are a couple of fisher boats in the foreground, or middle ground. So fishermen are associated with retirement, with a rustic lifestyle, with living close to nature. So this is one signal that the painting is for a man who's going to become himself a man of leisure, live in retirement. And adjacent to the boat, we see these two trees, and then in the distance, you see a couple of travelers moving back towards those distant mountains. The distant mountains also have another association in China. Oftentimes, tombs, burials take place in the mountains. So, of course, what is the ultimate progress of a life? It is towards those mountains. It is towards death. It's towards the end of life. So that's also being recognized in this bleak autumnal scene. There's a powerful diagonal that leads us from that early image, expansive image, into a view of a structure that was often placed on the outskirts of major cities. It's called the Wuliting, the 5-mile pavilion. And it was a custom in the Song dynasty of escorting your friend as he was leaving office, maybe to another post, or in this case to retirement. You accompanied your friend on the first 5 miles of his journey. And then you would have a little luncheon or dinner or some kind of a celebratory farewell. So we see that there are, in this painting, we see, in addition to these two elderly gentlemen, there are servants carrying things, there are other servants in the pavilion, and they're preparing for this last moment together. Now look at the two men who are making their way towards that pavilion. One of them is leaning on a staff, looking back with concern at his companion, who's bent over with age, being helped by a young attendant. This is undoubtedly a picture of the artist himself and the friend he's about to say goodbye to. So it becomes an extraordinarily personal reference embedded in this landscape. And then we look at the heart of the landscape. At the very center of this landscape, what do we see? We see these two craggy trees, leafless, but still standing upright, bent as they are, bent and gnarled from exposure to the elements for years on end. Are these not those two old gentlemen? And look, they're connected at the root. An extraordinarily poignant statement of how these men's friendship, like the two trees, will be deeply connected and will remain a monument to that sense of bonding. So this painting becomes suddenly a poignant use of landscape to describe personal feelings. So we're seeing how with Chinese art, there's always an under message, in addition to describing nature as a place of beauty, as a place of solace, as a place of mourning even, that in addition it carries a message of the humanity of the artist and of the recipient of those paintings. So this is a terribly important part of Chinese art, that in effect this painting becomes like a portrait. So landscape has that power and that capability. Now the same artist who did the horse and groom in tribute to Han Gan's Night Shining White, Zhang Mengfu, was an avid student of the past, and he constantly mined the past for inspiration. He actually saw Guo Xi's painting because there's a colophon by him attached to the painting. So we know that he had encountered that painting. And that also owns a landscape by Zhang Mengfu. That is what's on the top of the screen. And I think that landscape is directly inspired by Guo Xi's painting. He's rearranged the components. The two trees are now at the beginning of the scroll, and they're no longer leafless trees, they are pine trees. They keep their greenery through the winter. They struggle through adversity and survive. The distant mountains are now on the left side of the composition, and we can see one little fishing boat that wished for ability to retire. But in the case of Zhang Mengfu, he was serving under Kublai Khan, who was serving under the Mongols. It was a terribly difficult time for a Chinese scholar, particularly one who descended from the previous Song dynasty, to serve in office. But there he was. He was dedicating himself to trying to ameliorate the life of Chinese citizens under this harsh rule of the Mongols. So this painting was undoubtedly done for someone who understood Zhang Mengfu's circumstances. But look what he has done to change Guo Xi's way of painting. He's eliminated almost all of the ink wash that describes the surfaces of things in favor of pure brush line. We look up close, the trees and rocks, for example. The first thing he does, he adds an inscription directly on the painting. It's almost unheard of for an artist to do that, to do more than just a modest inscription. So he starts off right away by saying, this is Zhang's playfully made twin pines and level distance. So he's focusing on the importance of the pines juxtaposed against this distant vista. Look at the rock. The rock is like that calligraphic dry brushwork that we saw in Huang Tingzhen's calligraphy. He's using that dry brushwork to suggest the raspy, hard surface of the trees. With the rocks. The trees, he uses a center tip brush for the outlines and the strokes. It's called seal script. So he's using another kind of calligraphy in order to describe the trees, yet another for the sharp branches and twigs of the pines themselves. And then he does something even more audacious. At the very end of his scroll, he adds a long personal statement, and he writes directly on top of his own painting. And it's exactly at this moment, around 1300, when artists had conquered the illusion of recession in space. So even though the water and sky are all blank paper, you have a sense of this continuous recession going into the distance. And then what does he do? He confounds that representational skill by writing directly on top of the painting. It's an art historical comment about all of the different artists that he's seen in the past, and he admits that, well, my painting is not really of the same kind as theirs, but in fact it's a little bit different. Well, I'll say, he's making a real point there. So his painting becomes a kind of revolutionary statement that calligraphy is the essential element of painting, and that means that painting is ultimately about self-expression. So this is an image created for a friend that's really about his own state of mind and his own state of being at the time. Now, ironically, there is a colophon, an inscription appended to the scroll, so the hand scroll continues with blank paper, and one of his friends, a man named Yang Zai, added an inscription, which I'm showing you here on the screen. And in this inscription, he describes how there's a little boat going upstream, that the mountain trees are being shaken by the thunder claps, that the wind is rising, the wind and rain are pouring down as evening approaches, and the waves reach up to the heavens. Well, do you see that in the painting? Not at all. There's one little boat there, it looks very calm, very pacific, the trees do not look like they're being blown by the wind. But what Yang Zai is reflecting in his poem is the political circumstances that Zhang Mengfu was living under. He was indeed fighting upstream in an era when Mongols almost invariably did not use Southern officials, Southern scholars in their government. That there was an enormous amount of prejudice towards scholars from the south because they were the last to fall to the Mongol armies. So, in effect, the poem is telling us what we don't see in the painting. It's adding a footnote that says, actually, this man is painting this in a period of tumult, but you'd never know it from the painting. But this is the extraordinary thing about Chinese art. You have this possibility of augmenting a work of art by commentaries by later appreciators, including, in this case, a dear friend of the artist himself. A contemporary of Zhang Mengfu from the same city, Wuxing, was Chen Xuan. This is his response to the Mongol occupation of China. It's an extraordinarily different approach, but it's equally based on going to past models, to archaic models, as a way of revivifying the past and also making a connection to it. So Chen Xuan is here painting a story of the famous calligrapher Wang Xizhi, a 4th century man who also lived in a time when China was divided, when China was in part occupied by foreign invaders. And he's evoking an era of blue-green landscape style, this archaic style. Look at his mountains, for example. They're merely these repeated outlines that create triangular shapes. It's the most archaic form of painting mountains. The little huts that are in the foreground are kind of naive. They're childlike. Again, Chen Xuan is doing everything to sort of return the sophisticated paintings of his era back to this antiquity, which was a kind of golden age, which is a period when cultural men like Wang Xizhi could create cultural monuments even in a period of political distress. So this is a response to the present times by evoking a culture hero of the past, and in a way saying, our culture will survive this. We'll get through this period of difficulty. Just hang in there. So that's really the message that these artists were conveying, each in their own very individualistic way. Now, about 2 centuries later, China had returned to indigenous rule under the Ming Dynasty, and nonetheless, the ideal of retirement from government is never a clean or pretty place, as we know all too well. So Wen Zheming, one of the great artists in Suzhou, painted this work for a friend of his who had just decided to retire, return from the capital in Beijing, the city of Suzhou, which is near Shanghai, and which is still regarded as one of the most beautiful places in China. And so he created an imaginary painting of what Mr. Liu's retirement villa was going to look like. Hadn't been built yet, but Wen Zheming already knew what was required. So most important of all was going to be an elevated study, a 2-story hall where you could be above the trees in the wonderful seclusion of your garden to entertain friends. And so you look inside the hall, there are 2 friends seated at a table, there's a servant bringing wine or tea, there's a bookshelf with scrolls and books to entertain them. So this is a wonderful image of this idyllic life of retirement that is envisioned. The other thing that Wen Zheming has done, I think, is created an environment that is inviolate from the nasty world of politics and commerce outside of that garden. So he's isolated the garden by creating a stream and a wall, but there's a bridge, and the gate of the garden is open. So for friends who know how to get there, you can cross the stream, you enter the garden, and you are then suddenly in this world surrounded by the evergreens that enclose the hall to create this wonderful sense of serenity and peace. So this is the way in which art can be used to evoke the ideal of life in retirement, even if the reality may be quite different. Portraiture in China, therefore, was always a very minor part of the arts. It only really evolved, importantly, beyond ancestor portraits for the imperial ancestor halls in the 17th century, late 16th and 17th century. And it was always more important to represent your friend through these kind of idealized images of their gardens, of their pastimes. So real portraiture was almost always reserved as a way of preserving somebody's likeness so they could be venerated after they passed away. In fact, many times an artist created an image of someone before or after they died, and they sort of had a copybook and said, okay, so describe, was it a cheek like this, was the nose like that, how were the eyes? And you could put together a kind of composite, like a police composite image of the person. And in this case, we have actually the artist's grand uncle, who was 85 years old at the time, being portrayed, so clearly it's a portrait from life. But look at this man's gaunt features, and then look at the robe he's occupying. There's no way he could be that big. So there's a convention at work. He's been made grandiose because this capacious robe signals his stature. It's a concept rather than a reality. And even the face, if you look carefully, there's a wonderful sense of symmetry in the way in which the eyes, cheekbones, the nose, everything is drawn. So there may be a sense of individuality in the representation, but there's also a kind of stylization because we're idealizing this individual. We're making him into an image that is to be venerated by future generations. So that whole concept of portraiture has a very different purpose in China. And I want to talk about portraiture and figure painting as a way of understanding the way in which the representation of figures could be manipulated in the same way, whether it's an actual image of a historical individual or a living person. So let me go forward and just start by saying, here is Fu Sheng. He was a historical figure, again going back to the Qin dynasty, when the despot Qin Shi Huang ordered that all books should be burnt except for those of the legalist texts that he felt were the essential governing body of knowledge that he wanted to use. This man took it upon himself to hide one of the early texts in the wall of his home, and after the Qin fell, he brought it out, and in this painting, we see him in a garden, wonderful lush bananas growing behind him, the parapet wall of the garden is there, and look at this wonderful garden rock. The rock is as craggy as the man. So there's this sense of this survivor, someone who, like a rock, was obdurate in resisting the tyranny of the Qin. And so you have a government scribe transcribing the text that this man had preserved along with his commentary. And that's his daughter there, because the man's dialect was so hard to understand, she needed to actually interpret what he was saying. So you have this wonderful, craggy image of a man, but this is a man who lived about 1700 years before the artist painted him. So there's no way that there was any accurate likeness of this individual. So how did he come up with this image where he has this mostly a naked head with this very bulbous forehead, long eyebrows, wispy beard? Where did that come from? It came from Buddhism. There's a parallel example, it's a little more stylized and humorous, but the same kind of exaggerated forehead, wispy beard, and eyelashes we see in this work by Wu Bin from the end of the Ming Dynasty, so maybe 100 years after Fu Sheng was depicted by Du Jin. But in that painting, we see a kind of caricature taking place, that the same techniques for creating different personalities are being used at an almost cartoon-like level. I love the different ways in which the faces are really these smirking, rather laughable characters, and in the next image you can see it reminds me of Dick Tracy. There was one anti-hero called Old Prune Face, I think. So this Lohan, so some of these men, these are supposedly these spiritual masters, Lohans or Arhats, who preserve the Buddhist law, living in the wilderness until the coming of the Messiah, the coming of the future Buddha. And so this is a scroll that's celebrating these different men, some of whom look sort of pig-like, they're overweight. Others have been sitting in the same place so long that a tree is growing up around them. So these are these fantastical creatures who represent the combined wisdom and the tenacity to preserve the Buddhist law in the wilderness, in this world, until the future Buddha arrives. So this is a humorous celebration, but the way in which figures are drawn then is about conveying a message. It's not merely about capturing the likeness of a historical personage. I want to end with one last tribute to the role of art and artists that I think is extremely important for any student of art to appreciate. It's a work by a man who was about 19 or 20 years old when he did this. He was clearly an extraordinary talent. His name is Chen Hongshou, and he did this album, and I'm taking a series of images from this album, about the year 1619, 1620. And it's very small. The album is about 8 inches square, and the painting occupies only a small part of that 8 inches. So it's barely larger than a couple of postage stamps. But it is an extraordinary tribute to the nature of art itself. So I start with an image of a bonsai. Bonsai is taking nature and making it into a work of art. So it is exactly what the landscape painter does. It's exactly what the figure painter does. He modifies reality to make it into something that it becomes a work of art. So in this case, we see a beautiful crackelored vase, and in the vase are these miniature plants. The plants themselves are very significant. There's an old craggy pine, there's a plum that's just that's beginning to blossom, and there's bamboo. Well, those are the 3 friends of wintry weather in China. Those are the survivors. Those are the plants that are emblematic of how a noble individual can survive the winds of vicissitudes of nature. Bamboo bends in the winds of adversity but returns to the upright. It has a hollow heart, so it's emptied out of misguiding emotions. The plum blossom is the first tree to bloom, oftentimes when snow is still on the ground, and the pine retains its greenery through the winter. So these are survivors, but they've been now co-opted by the artist into a work of art. So his painting is a tribute to that, and that's his seal and signature adjacent to them. In the next image, he's moved us outdoors. There's this extraordinary, elaborate basin. Maybe it's made of jade. It's filled with water, sitting on its ornate lacquered tripod with fabric. We know we're outside because as we can see a few leaves on the ground. Look inside the basin. The basin has become a mirror. The water in the basin is reflecting the moon. So of course the mirror is a trope for a work of art. It's reflecting nature. And in this case, he's captured the moon in this ornate basin. Well, there are all kinds of associations with the moon, and he plays with that in the very next image, as he does by incorporating a mirror as well. So that 8-lobed bronze mirror, we're looking at the mirror's shiny face. We're not the only ones looking at the mirror. There's a flower looking at itself in the mirror as well. We can see its reflection in the mirror. There are 2 other things besides the mirror that are in this painting. There is a hairpin and a ring. Now look at the ring. You squint very carefully, I think you can see that there's an image of a rabbit or a hare in the ring. Well, every Chinese would know right away where we are. We're in the moon. Because the moon goddess keeps the hair of immortality, beating out the elixir of immortality in the moon. So here's her ring, her hairpin, and her mirror for her to admire herself. So we know that we've now not just made the leap from the reflection of the moon, we've gone to the moon itself. There are famous stories of the Tang Emperor who owned Han Gan's Night Shining White, who owned that stallion. In legend, he went to the moon to court the moon goddess. So we've made a full circle now. We're back in the Tang Dynasty, we're in the moon. And then, the ultimate trope of the artist is that art can actually fool nature, that art can take the place of nature. So what has Chen Hongshou done here? He's created an image of a fan, a silk gauze fan with a painting of chrysanthemums on the surface of the fan. He's added his own inscription and his seal right onto the fan, so it's a work of art. And then what happened? Well, a butterfly came along and tried to land on the flowers of the fan. And we see the butterfly partly through the gauze of the fan, so we actually see a sense of space there. The butterfly is trying to get to the flower. Well, those of you who know your Pliny, you know that there's a famous story that he recorded before he met his end looking at Mount Vesuvius' eruption. He talked about a competition between two Greek artists, Zeuxis and Perihetius. Zeuxis very proudly said, I can paint grapes so realistic that birds fly down and start pecking at the painting because they think it's real. Said Perihetius. Well, come to my studio tomorrow. So Zeuxis arrives and he sees this curtain on the wall. He said, okay, open the curtain, show me your painting. And then he realizes the curtain is the painting. The young Chen Hongshou, age of 19 or 20, is showing us what he can do, what art is all about, how he can manipulate art to move us from this world to the moon, that he can fool nature, that he can even bring us inside of these extraordinary power of art and make us believers as well. That art can change the world, that it can change nature by doing something that nature cannot do. And that is one of the great statements that a great critic, Dong Jichang, made back in the 16th century. He said, if what you appreciate is the beauty of nature, then painting can never compete. But if you admire the art of brush and ink, then nature can never compete with art. So I feel like there's room for both in our world. We have to make room for both. So I thank you for what you do to make art part of our world, and I hope you will often use the Met as a resource in that work. Thank you all.